Picture yourself as a newborn human. You can't stand up. You can't speak a single word. You can't put food in your own mouth. Your body can't even keep itself warm without help. You have no concept of what a predator is, though plenty of predators would recognize you instantly as easy prey. You tip the scales at roughly 3 kilograms, and frankly, you're a walking, or rather, non-walking, recipe for disaster. And yet, you exist, which means every single one of your ancestors, stretching back through thousands of generations, somehow managed to keep a creature this fragile alive. Not just for a day or a week, but long enough that they went on to have more children, generation after generation, for around 300,000 years straight. This isn't just an intriguing puzzle, it's deeply personal. If even one link in that ancestral chain had broken, just once, you wouldn't be here. You simply wouldn't exist at all. That thought alone is a little jarring. But here's what makes it genuinely fascinating. Figuring out how early humans managed to raise surviving children isn't merely a collection of quaint old customs. It's a glimpse into one of the most advanced forms of social cooperation ever to appear in nature. Cooperation that most of us rarely stop to consider, and that modern life has quietly walked away from, often to our own detriment. Let's begin with a question people rarely stop to ask. Why is giving birth to humans so unusually hard? Most animals arrive in the world ready to move. A newborn giraffe falls almost 2 meters to the ground and is trotting around within the hour. A foal is upright and walking in under 2 hours. Even chimpanzees, our nearest evolutionary cousins, can cling on to their mothers almost the moment they're born. Human infants can do none of that. A newborn baby is utterly helpless for months on end, relying on other people for absolutely everything. This isn't some unfortunate glitch in our design. It's a calculated evolutionary compromise, and scientists have a specific term for it: secondary altriciality. It sounds technical, but the concept is simple. Compared to nearly every other primate, human infants arrive at an earlier stage of development relative to what their bodies will eventually need. The reason comes down to the brain. Here's the core issue. The human brain is massive, not just in absolute terms, but far larger than what our body size would typically call for. If a baby's brain were allowed to reach full development before birth, the skull would be too large to pass through the birth canal. So evolution found a workaround that's clever, if a little unsettling. It made us deliver our babies early. In a real sense, every human is born premature. At the moment of birth, the brain has reached only about a quarter of its adult size, compared to roughly 45% in newborn chimps. That means an enormous portion of brain growth, development that other species complete in weeks or months, has to unfold over years, entirely outside the womb, while the infant remains completely exposed and completely dependent. Researchers call this tension the obstetric dilemma, and it points to something essential. A human baby simply cannot survive on its own, not even briefly. Our species literally cannot reproduce without a support network. This reframes the entire question. Understanding how ancient humans kept their children alive isn't really about individual competence. It's about how groups organized themselves, and the answer they arrived at was remarkable. You've probably heard the saying that raising a child takes an entire community. These days it's become something of a greeting card phrase, printed on posters and repeated at baby showers. But here's what most people miss. In the context of human evolution, this wasn't a nice sentiment. It was a literal survival mechanism, and one so effective that many anthropologists believe it helped Homo sapiens outlast every other early human species on Earth. This concept is known as cooperative breeding, and the logic works like this. In most primates, raising offspring falls almost entirely on the mother, with the father contributing only occasionally. That structure puts a hard cap on how many dependent young a mother can manage at once. Humans broke away from this pattern in a major way. Throughout the hunter-gatherer period, which makes up the overwhelming majority of our species' history, childcare wasn't confined to 1 or 2 parents. It was spread across the entire group, not as an occasional kindness, but as a core part of how the community operated. Grandmothers, in particular, played an outsized role, so much so that there's an entire scientific framework built around this idea, aptly named the grandmother hypothesis. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes introduced this theory in the 1990s, arguing that human menopause, itself a biological rarity among animals, evolved specifically so older women could redirect their energy away from having more children of their own and toward helping their grandchildren survive instead. Consider what that implies. Women live for decades beyond their fertile years because a seasoned grandmother's contribution to child survival was so valuable that evolution essentially traded her future fertility for her caregiving expertise. And the evidence backs this up. Research on traditional societies shows that having a living maternal grandmother meaningfully boosts a child's odds of survival. In some populations, it ranks among the strongest predictors of whether a child reaches age 2. It wasn't limited to grandmothers either. Aunts, uncles, older siblings, and even unrelated adults within the group all pitched in with childcare in ways that are practically unheard of among other primates. Young children were routinely handed off, held, fed, and watched by a rotating cast of adults throughout the day. Anthropologists studying present-day hunter-gatherer communities, which offer a rough window into ancestral behavior, have found striking examples. Among the Aka people of Central Africa, fathers stay within arm's reach of their infants nearly 47% of the time, a level of involvement that surpasses many fathers in modern industrialized nations. The bigger takeaway is that ancient children were woven into a thick web of relationships, not just tethered to two parents. This wasn't a lofty ideal. It was practical survival strategy. Now let's touch on a subject that tends to catch modern listeners off guard. In early human societies, nursing an infant bore little resemblance to how we picture it today. Start with duration. Across traditional cultures, and among our closest primate relatives, nursing commonly continued for 2 to 4 years, and sometimes even longer. The World Health Organization now recommends breastfeeding through at least age 2, a figure that surprises many people, but from an evolutionary lens, stopping earlier would have been genuinely risky. Then there's frequency. Mothers in hunter-gatherer groups typically nurse their infants many times an hour. Some estimates put it at roughly 4 feedings per hour during the earliest months. This near-constant nursing accomplished several things at once. It delivered nutrition, calmed the infant's stress response, and, critically, suppressed ovulation, naturally spacing births about 3 to 4 years apart. That spacing wasn't incidental. One of the most reliable patterns found across hunter-gatherer populations is a 3 to 4 year gap between siblings. This reflects the biological reality of a species where one child needed to reach relative independence before the next arrived, a matter of survival rather than choice. There's another surprising element here too. Wet nursing, one woman breastfeeding a child who isn't her own, turns out to be an ancient and widespread practice found across many cultures. Anthropological evidence indicates that multiple women within a group would often nurse each other's children. This didn't just keep sick or orphaned infants alive. It also strengthened bonds between families in ways that likely paid off in broader survival terms. Breast milk, in effect, functioned as a shared community resource. Now think through the practical challenge facing a mother in the Pleistocene era. She has to gather food, likely covering several kilometers of rough terrain on foot, all while keeping a completely helpless baby alive. What's the solution? Setting the infant down isn't an option. Predators are a real threat, and other dangers lurk as well. The baby can't regulate its own body heat. Getting too cold could kill it in a surprisingly short window. And an infant left alone and crying is essentially an advertisement to any nearby carnivore. The strategy our ancestors settled on was simple and remarkably well supported by modern research. Near constant physical contact, carrying infants against the body, what today we call baby wearing, appears to be the default behavior for our species throughout most of its history. The evidence supporting this comes from several angles. Physically, newborns possess a powerful grasping reflex. Press a finger into a baby's palm, and it grips with surprising strength. This reflex is thought to be a holdover from an ancestral need to cling onto a caregiver's body. Neurologically, infant brains appear wired to expect close physical contact. Studies show that skin-to-skin contact helps stabilize an infant's heart rate, breathing, temperature, and stress hormones. Babies who are carried more often cry noticeably less, not because they're being indulged, but because physical closeness satisfies a genuine biological need. Cross-cultural research backs this up. In societies where infants are carried throughout the day, crying rates run dramatically lower, by some estimates, around 50% less than in societies where babies spend considerable time alone. That crying isn't just fussiness. From an evolutionary standpoint, it's a distress signal tied to perceived danger. Ancient infants were almost certainly held for the majority of their waking hours, slept touching a caregiver's body, and were rarely if ever left by themselves. Modern parenting norms, by contrast, have spent the past century moving in the opposite direction. Cribs, separate bedrooms, rigid schedules, sleep training programs. Some of this works well enough for many families. But it's worth recognizing that, in the broader sweep of human history, we're effectively running a large, loosely monitored experiment on our own species. Eventually, every infant needs to move beyond milk, and this is where ancestral practices get considerably less polished, and occasionally a bit stomach-turning by modern standards. Introducing solid food in ancient societies looked nothing like today's neatly packaged purees. There were no organic fruit pouches, no precisely engineered first food formulas. There was simply whatever the group had managed to gather or hunt that day. Prepared, however, was feasible at the time. The most widespread method for softening food for infants across ancient and traditional cultures was pre-chewing. An adult would chew food themselves before passing it into the infant's mouth. To modern sensibilities, this sounds alarming, and it's true that it transfers oral bacteria from adult to child. But here's an interesting wrinkle. Some of that transferred bacteria may actually be beneficial. Research suggests that infants fed this way may pick up helpful oral microbes from caregivers, potentially giving early immune development a boost. This practice isn't unique to humans, either. Chimpanzees pre-chew food for their young too, suggesting the behavior likely predates our species and stretches back through much of our genus's history. Beyond pre-chewing, ancient children were introduced fairly early to soft, easily consumed foods, marrow extracted from cracked bones, which packs a dense calorie punch, along with mashed plants, eggs, and small portions of fish or meat. The overall diet was strikingly diverse. Interestingly, analysis of ancient dental remains suggests that children raised in hunter-gatherer societies generally had better nutrition and fewer cavities than children from early farming communities, who relied heavily on starchy grains. In other words, hunter-gatherer kids often had healthier teeth than children from the early Bronze Age. Turns out a varied diet beats one dominated by bread. Here's another aspect of ancestral child rearing that modern audiences find surprising. Nobody slept in isolation. We've touched on physical closeness already, but sleep deserves its own discussion because it diverges so sharply from today's expectations. Across essentially every studied hunter-gatherer society and most traditional cultures worldwide, infants and young children slept in direct physical contact with at least one adult, not in a separate room, not in a crib, but pressed against another human body through the night. This arrangement, commonly called co-sleeping or bed sharing, isn't some fringe modern parenting trend. It's the default behavior for roughly 99% of human history. Modern Western medicine raises legitimate objections to co-sleeping, chiefly the risk of accidental suffocation, particularly in soft bedding or when a caregiver's alertness is compromised. These are valid concerns given today's specific conditions. But in ancestral settings, firm sleeping surfaces, alert and sober caregivers, cooler environments, those same risks didn't apply in the same way. And the developmental benefits of co-sleeping are well documented. Steadier body temperature, more regulated breathing, more frequent nighttime nursing, and notably longer breastfeeding duration overall. There's also a compelling theory linking co-sleeping to sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. Anthropologist James McKenna, who has devoted decades to researching infant sleep, has proposed that the natural rhythm of an adult's breathing and movement during sleep may help stabilize an infant's own breathing patterns during the developmental period, when that regulation is still unreliable. Whether this specific mechanism is fully confirmed or not, the broader point holds. Human infant biology appears to have evolved expecting physical closeness during sleep. The private nursery is a remarkably recent invention, and given how the infant mortality numbers looked for most of human history, something in the traditional approach was clearly working, at least to some extent. Let's be candid about one thing. For the vast majority of human history, child mortality was extraordinarily high by today's standards. The best available estimates suggest that somewhere between 30 and 50% of children in Paleolithic and early Neolithic populations died before reaching age 5. This wasn't a failure of care or attention. It happened because ancient people had no concept of germ theory, no antibiotics, no vaccines, no modern nutritional science, and none of the countless tools that have collectively driven child mortality down by roughly 96% since the year 1800. Ancient caregivers worked with what they had, and some of it genuinely helped. Medicinal plant use, for instance, goes back a very long way. Even chimpanzees are known to self-medicate using specific plants, and archaeological evidence points to deliberate herbal remedies dating back at least 50,000 years. Many traditional societies built up extensive plant-based medical knowledge that researchers still mine today for pharmaceutical breakthroughs. Willow bark, essentially nature's aspirin, was used to manage pain and fever for millennia. Honey served as an antimicrobial wound dressing in ancient Egypt, and quite possibly long before that. Garlic carries genuine antimicrobial properties that ancient peoples identified through experience alone, long before they had any scientific explanation for why it worked. None of this could stop bacterial meningitis or severe dehydration, but it wasn't worthless either. Ritual, too, was universal. Every documented human culture has developed ceremonies surrounding birth and early childhood, naming rites, protective symbols, prayers, and rites of passage. To a contemporary observer, these might look like empty superstition, but anthropologists argue they serve genuine social purposes. They knit the community together around the new child. They publicly distributed responsibility for the child's welfare across the group. And they gave people a psychological framework for processing grief when children, as they often did, didn't survive. Evidence shows this grief was real and deeply felt. Infant burials found at archaeological sites are frequently arranged with care, sometimes accompanied by grave goods or flowers. The notion that ancient people were emotionally detached from child loss, that life was so precarious that death barely registered, simply doesn't hold up against the archaeological record. They grieved. They made every effort they could. And slowly, across countless generations, they built up enough practical knowledge to gradually improve a child's odds of survival. Now here's the part that tends to catch people off guard. In several respects, ancient child-rearing practices were more effective than what has replaced them. Not across the board, not even close. Vaccines, sanitation, and modern medicine are beyond question. The collapse in child mortality over the 20th century stands as one of humanity's greatest accomplishments, full stop. No reasonable person is suggesting we return to a world where 40% of children died young. But within the realm of behavioral and social child rearing, the emotional and physical environment surrounding early childhood, there's a solid case that industrialized societies have dismantled support systems without fully grasping what those systems were providing. Consider the extended family network that once distributed caregiving across many adults. In much of the modern West, families have shrunk to a nuclear core at best, often scattered across cities or continents, sometimes profoundly isolated. Constant physical contact throughout the day has been replaced by bouncers, swings, and playpens, devices explicitly built to occupy a baby without requiring anyone to hold it. Communal sleeping arrangements have given way to the solo nursery, alongside a cultural unease around dependence that, viewed through an evolutionary lens, seems genuinely out of step with our biology. None of this represents some personal failing on the part of parents. It's the byproduct of specific economic and social shifts, urbanization, dual-income households, and the erosion of extended family structures. These changes occurred for reasons entirely unrelated to child welfare, and the parents navigating them today are doing the best they can within the system they've inherited. Still, the documented rates of postpartum depression, infant sleep struggles, and parental exhaustion in industrialized nations are real, well-recorded, and notably elevated. Comparing the social structure modern parents operate within to the one our species actually evolved for reveals a striking gap. The ancestral answer to keeping a child alive was never handle it alone. It wasn't even primarily handle it as a couple. It was handle it as a group. Share the burden. Distribute the fatigue. Ensure that no single adult ever bears sole responsibility for a child's survival. That wasn't philosophy, it was practical design. So how did early humans manage to keep their children alive? They kept them in near constant physical contact. They nursed them for years at a stretch. They slept beside them every single night. They softened food for them by chewing it themselves. They surrounded them with an entire network of engaged adults, grandmothers, aunts, uncles, neighbors, friends, each one genuinely invested in that child's well-being. They mourned deeply when children died, which happened all too often. They worked to understand illness using whatever tools were available to them, however limited. They built rituals to hold their communities together through grief. And slowly, across generations, they accumulated knowledge and passed it forward through tradition, spoken practice, and eventually the written word. The one constant thread running through every culture, every era, and every corner of the globe is this: children thrived when embedded in strong social bonds, and struggled when left isolated. That pattern isn't confined to the ancient past, it still holds true today. We've developed extraordinary tools for keeping children physically safe. We've made enormous strides against the biological threats that once claimed roughly half of all children before they reached school age. That progress is real and profoundly valuable. But the social infrastructure, the dense, overlapping network of shared human care that our species spent hundreds of thousands of years refining, is the piece we're still working out how to hold on to. Ancient humans had no antibiotics, no ultrasounds, no infant formula, no pediatricians, no car seats. What they had was each other. And as it turns out, for most of what truly mattered, that was enough.